I would like to invite all of us to gather together. Everyone's had their donuts, right? I just want to make sure I'm still slow in mind. Okay, here we are. Welcome online. Welcome. Welcome in those in person for a one-time session on spiritual direction. We have a spiritual director in our midst. Thank you, Jeannie, for being here. And I'll be welcoming all comments and responses, ideas that go together, and we can all do that together. But as we begin our time, I'm going to begin with a prayer and kind of settle us in for this day. So let us bow in prayer. Loving God, gracious God, for the beauty of this day and for this opportunity to be together to talk about important things, to figure out how we might understand your presence more clearly and more closely and more deeply in our lives. We know you're with us as we share these conversations together and as we move on into this journey. Oh, we give you thanks and praise on. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So here we are. Anyone know the phrase spiritual direction?
I've heard it.
I've heard it. Here's how I came across spiritual direction, just a little foundation for this. I'm off at breakfast with my best friend, pastor colleague back in Cleveland, John Lenz. The pastor of Forest Hill Presbyterian Church in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. My church in Lyndhurst is about 5 miles down Mayfield Road. We gather once a month just to catch up. We went to Yale together, and John's still at Forest Hill Church. Great guy. We're having breakfast, and he says, 2 members of my church were out at Ghost Ranch. I said, oh, Ghost Ranch. We're talking about Ghost Ranch a lot. Then he says, yeah, they're out there because they were taking a spiritual direction course. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me. Spiritual direction. That's what that little pamphlet is I get every year. It says Ignatian Spirituality Institute. I had no idea what Ignatian was. I thought I knew what spirituality might be. And institute, well, okay. I asked John more about this, and he said, oh, yeah, they love it. It's a great ministry in the church. It's transforming what we're doing here. People are getting close to understanding who God is in their life. Oh, spiritual direction is wonderful. And so, what do I do after this breakfast? I go back to my office, and what comes in the mail that day was this same pamphlet. That day, that very day, I received one a year earlier and a year earlier and a year earlier, and it kept going to the recycling bin. This time, I looked at the phone number and I called the director. The next week, I was interviewing with her, and then the next week, we had a plan that I would be starting in the fall. That's how I started. That's my spiritual direction story. Little did I know that it would be so much work. The last 2 years I was in Ohio, we were in Ohio, I would spend the first year almost every Wednesday night for 2 hours at John Carroll University, right? Not too far from where we lived. And the next year it was every other Wednesday night. And by that point, after going through having directees and having a supervisor myself and all these practical ways of spiritual direction, I got my certificate, and a few months later, I moved to Santa Fe. That's my history of spiritual direction up until I moved here. And so you might be wondering, why was I so excited? Why did I go and call the day I got this pamphlet Why did John Lentz with the lead tell me about what it was doing to his congregation? Well, spiritual direction is a way that we might understand the basic question, where is God? Where is God in your life? You may not use the word God, you may use the word universe. Where is God? Where am I in this life of mine? What do I do for this? Where am I placed? How do I make sense of the life around me? What do I do about? And that's spiritual direction. You have somebody walk on a journey with you. To listen, not to debate, someone to care and not correct, somebody to simply be a companion on a journey with whatever you will be sharing or going through. And I'll get to some more important matters here, but one note is I've had a lot of training in counseling, not to be certified. So don't ask me to be a certified counselor. I don't have that background, nor can I do that. But there are no wrong answers in spiritual direction. It's coming from who you are. There's not a sense that we're starting from a place of deficit or that something went wrong in your life and trying to fix it. Trying to see where you are now and move forward. And maybe go back to those areas, but it's up to you. A guide, not a therapist. A companion, not somebody who's going to direct you into the right way of thinking. And so, a little foundation of spiritual direction, George.
Given what you say, and given what you said before about spirit and breath and wind and etc., spiritual direction is learning which way to turn when the wind is blowing and you don't know how to, can't figure out how to get enough breath.
Huh?
Now, I don't want to reveal totally my ignorance, but anyway, that would be a literal translation of spiritual direction, given the historical understandings of spirit and direction, maybe, I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay.
But the companionship, I think, is an important piece.
Right. And so, yeah, thank you, George. And so let your mind wander a little bit with those two words. Let your mind wander by what you may have heard about spiritual direction in your past from your Catholic friends, perhaps, because they're the ones who are well versed in this, more than Protestants. Because this has not been part of our tradition for a long time until recently. So, I don't know, the last 20, 25 years did we ever hear about spiritual direction, at least in my experience. So, Jeannie, anything to add? Anything? I mean, there's so much to say, but anything to refine, define from what you're?
I think just to tag on to what you said, George, that it's not necessarily a time when you've lost your way. It very much can just be that you just want to be with someone in your journey as you're finding a deeper way. So it's not usually used for an experience of trauma. It can be, very much can be, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be very much your own wanting a deeper walk.
Which is, the illustration used of meeting your seminary classmate for a monthly go around over breakfast. That was an important part of your ministry, I'm sure, at that time. And at least that was my experience in 2 or 3 different groupings I was in, was you had your journey companion or your journey brother or whatever.
Yep. Well, what I'm doing then is giving you some papers that I received in my course way back when. And I'm taking notes of who is online, and I will email these papers to you. But hopefully you can hear. It didn't seem exciting for me to put it on the screen and we just read it through together as much as talk about what these words might mean. And I will, like I say, take your names here and make sure I get them to you this afternoon or tomorrow. And I'm just making sure I have everybody here. Okay, gotcha. What I have here in a paper, you'll see it right here, just so you know that this is what we're looking at. It's a little bundle of pages from my spiritual direction course. And I'll read the first part since we all don't have it in our hands. Within each of us lies the desire to find meaning beyond the moment, to discover our true selves, to grow closer to God and to one another. Spiritual direction can help you satisfy that longing. And then there's a Jesuit named William Barry, who I read a lot of his books in our course, and he defines spiritual direction as this: as help given by one Christian to another, which enables that person to pay attention to God's personal communication to him or her, to respond to this personally communicating God, to grow in intimacy with this God, and to live out the consequences of the relationship. The focus on this type of spiritual direction is on experience, not ideas, and specifically on religious experience. And so then finally, you have the page in front before you, you will soon the other one's online. It encourages you to discover and explore a closer relationship with God. In the midst of a busy life, many people find it difficult to notice God's action in their daily affairs. Yet at the deepest level, all of us long for a more conscious experience of God's presence and love. So, a little foundation again. So let me tell you then what it looked like for me to go to a course like this. And that may help you share with me the experience I had by going through spiritual direction. I was one of 11 students, one of 2 men, the only Protestant. There were 9 Catholic women, 1 high Episcopalian woman, 1 Catholic man, and me. There I was. I did not know the language, but I was so excited to be part of something called spiritual direction. I became the token Protestant. In fact, the women in this course were all on the progressive side of the church, where the diocese in Cleveland with the archbishop was more conservative at that moment, and they weren't happy with what was going on. And so they went to a renegade priest church in downtown Cleveland. And I say renegade because he wasn't abiding by the archbishop nor the pope at the time, and he was doing really exciting, fun things in his church. I'm not sure how long he lasted. By doing that, you don't last long if you go up against authority. But I do know the women would come to my church every so often and experience a Presbyterian service. We spent week after week after week trying to figure out what spiritual direction was Ignatian style. Anyone heard of Ignatius? Okay, we have a few people with their hands raised on Ignatius of Loyola. On the second, let's see, how many pages back?
3 or 4.
3 or 4, yeah. So go back 3 or 4, and you'll see Ignatius of Loyola. You'll see a little thumbnail sketch of Ignatius. Let me just kind of fill in the lines here because it's an amazing story. Ignatius was the founder of the Jesuits, just so you put it in some kind of context. In fact, the only time I ever heard of Ignatius was when one of the high schools in Cleveland on the west side was called St. Ignatius. In the Catholic schools, they had a big football program. And so I would see them on the sports page, but I never heard of Ignatius before. So Ignatius, born in 1491, what happened in 1492? Yeah, it puts you in some kind of framework. He was born right before Columbus discovered America. He's in Spain, lives to 1556. He's in the military. His family's military. And he loved the idea of becoming famous because of all the exploits he would do as a military man, as a soldier. And then one day in a battle, a cannonball shatters his leg. Can't even imagine it. Cannonball, first of all, and then shattering your leg. What do you do with that? Well, as it says here, for vanity's sake, he decided he did not want any kind of anesthesia, whatever that might mean back in those days. So just fix me up. I can take it. And it was his personality. He can do everything. And he did, and he had to recuperate, and he found himself in this big house, and there were no other books that were around him to read, except all of these kind of, drugstore, dime store type novels, the damsel in distress, and, the chivalrous knight comes in and saves the. So he had all of those kind of stories to read, but very little else. And he wasn't satisfied after reading those stories. It was kind of getting to him at a deep level. He thought it would, but then there was one book about the life of Christ and then another one about the life of the saints. He read those, and they were different than his other novels. They were something that touched him. It went deep into his soul that he couldn't get enough of the life of Christ. Learning about this Christ figure and all the saints who had followed Christ. And so that joy lingered, as it says here, and he had delight after reading those stories as opposed to the other one. Then he had a conversion. Saw the vision of the Mother of God. Then he made a pilgrimage to her shrine. Then he runs into a Moor who was disrespectful of all this kind of a pilgrimage. And he was pretty upset, as it says here, tremendous anger, and well, he allows a mule to make the choice, whether he kills this Moor or he goes on to the other path towards discernment. Thank goodness for the mule. Thank goodness. If the mule went the other direction, there may not be the Ignatius that we know today. He spent time in a cave, praying and fasting. It was there he wrote the spiritual exercises, written about 1541 or so, and 25 years after that, to its 1531, until his death in 1556. And so you see more about what he was trying to figure out. There was nothing new in his spiritual exercises than what he had read in other places, but he put it all together and organized it in such a way that it was easier for people then to go on such a spiritual exercise. Yeah.
This is very helpful because we did the annotation 19 spiritual exercises about 30 years ago, but in doing them, having spent most of my life looking at learning and how people integrate information differently, I was amazed at, within those exercises, all education theory that had been great loose insights in the 80s and beyond our 80s, 1980s and beyond, were embedded in his approach. That you tap into kinesthetic learning, that you do auditory, that you're looking at your experience, that the visual is important, that you imagine, you tap into intuition and imagination. And in doing all of that, you have integration of mind and body. He did this in the 14, 15 hundreds, and I was always amazed at that. But this narrative of this journey says that that was coming from a spiritual plane, not an intellectual. Let's see, how do people learn? What is the brain's function? It was maybe tapping into his intuition of the spirit that brought forward these exercises. Perhaps I'm just
Right.
thinking
Right.
the connection.
No, an amazing story of his life. Amazing man to start with. Amazing transformation of his life. In the midst of trying to deal with a horrific injury, and look what takes place afterward. He changes. He was one of these personalities that he had to give it his all. That if you were to fast, now he had a spiritual director type person helping him at times, and would say it would be good for you to fast. Well, that wasn't good enough for him just to fast. It was good enough. It was only good enough for him if he was the best faster in the world. He would fast as long as anybody else could and longer. He would make sure it was his job to make that he felt good about himself because he was the best. And that became a detriment to his spiritual direction, that personality. And so he had to learn not to think that he had to do it the best, but he had to discern the spirits, which is a big part of spiritual direction. Discern, is this a good thing you're doing? Is this of God? Or is this against God? And his fasting attitude was against God. It wasn't going to lead anywhere except in bad ways. So you see, there's this ongoing struggle with Ignatius. Discern the spirits, good or bad.
Good thing he didn't stay with war.
Yeah, that's right. His goal was to be the most chivalrous, the best soldier, the best whatever. Then what does that lead to? Right, right. Came from a prosperous family as well. So it wasn't like he was, in poverty and doing all the. He came from money, and so he was able to do some things that other people could not do. So I want to just go back a second and see why you might be wanting to be part of spiritual direction. On the first page again. Again, people online, I'll be sending this to you, Janet. And add Janet to the list. And I will. It says here at the bottom, why might you want to be part of a spiritual direction experience? Identify and trust your own experiences of God, perhaps. Integrate spirituality into your daily life. Discern and make difficult choices. Share struggles, losses, or disappointments. Find encouragement and affirmation. Grow in relationship with God, self, others, and creation. That's taken with Spiritual Directors International, which is, well, this is in our area now. And so Joyner down in Albuquerque at the First Congregational Church, she's still there. So yeah, she was the head of Spiritual Directors International program. And so, it happens here as well. There's been a big group of people, and Jeannie, you know all about this. You're part of the group of spiritual directors that are around this area. You want to say anything more about that at all?
Well, they just had a conference in Santa Fe last year, I guess it was. And it drew about 2,000 people. So there are many, many spiritual directors throughout the country, and it's like a wave because there's no such thing ever in our minds, especially in the Protestant.
Yeah.
Years ago, 5 years ago.
Okay, right, there you are. There's a deep need, apparent. We're not making this up. We're seeing the deep need for people to, in the world we live in. I have a lot to do with it, but every generation has the same sense. The world isn't what you want it to be. You don't know where the sacred is, where God is in your life. And so spiritual direction is one of those ways that we might be able to see better, hear better, experience better. I likened it this morning to wherever we woke up in our area in Santa Fe to fog everywhere. And as I drove to church, it was lifting. I could see the mountains and fine. I got clearer as I went along. Wouldn't it be great if we had a spiritual direction that may help us when we start off in the fog of living, where things may become a little clearer as you go this journey. And so that's another part of spiritual direction. And let me just say this: we're going to do an exercise in a few moments. And there's so much to read, and you can read all of these different parts to it. But I'm going to give you a sense of the 4 movements of spiritual direction. And it comes in different ways. You can go through a 30-day retreat, a 19th, what's yours called?
Annotation
Yeah.
19.
Yeah.
Was, they broke up the 30 days into 19 weeks. And anyway, the point was you didn't have to go and stay. You would do over time the exercises guided by a Jesuit, and you go back and forth to that guide every week.
Right. And so that was a way to get through it. And you go, kind of a curriculum to go through. You're reading different scriptures that have a different focus. You can do an 8-day retreat, but you may spend 5 weeks on one of those days until you can move forward into the next one. And so there's different ways. If you can't go on a retreat for 30 days, like most of us can't, then you do it as Elise did. You do it from where you are, and you touch base with the spiritual direction. So the first movement, which we will start next week, we're going to do this all the way past Easter into Pentecost to get a flow during worship of the scriptures that I'll choose in the theme that there.
Oh, I just want to clarify one thing for people that aren't, aware a lot of spiritual direction. It is not a Christian concept or organization. I mean, there are Jewish spiritual directors, Buddhist spiritual directors. So it runs the gamut of, seeking a spirit or God in that particular direction.
Right. Yep. So yeah, there are all different types, but there's probably some thread going through it all. It's trying to understand deeply the sacred that we do not see, but know that there's something more to this life than what we experience. And what might that be? Well, we have ways of approaching that. So my training in Ignatian spirituality is similar but not the same as other spiritual direction that you may find. Yeah.
I think what I experience over and over again is the focus in our religious thinking on the metaphors, religious metaphors, which we then translate literally. So the metaphor becomes the scientific explanation of what the experience is. And that can be helpful, but it can also get in the way of growth or maturation. But constantly exploring those metaphors to say, what's behind that? What is the experience? Or Micah, what is the thing that's required of thee? What is it all about, Alfie?
Yeah.
What's the essence of this? And what are we trying to get at with this reality?
Mm-hmm. Well, what we're trying to get at with this Ignatian spirituality in the 4 movements is simply this, and it follows really the cycle of the gospel. And so the first movement would be knowing, understanding in yourself that God loves you deeply. You can't move on to the next movement until you have a sense that you are loved by God. You are the beloved. You are so cherished by God. And that may take people years. or ever. They never get beyond that because they don't feel that way. Whatever may have been part of their life beforehand, this is the big struggle. I don't feel love. How can God love me? You go through all of this, and you go through scripture and discussion and stories and all this, and it never quite gets there for some. Other ones, right? You go through it and you say, okay, I'm ready for the next one. But don't move from one movement to the next until you really deep down, not to just sound good or look good, until you really know, okay, I think God now does love me. That's the first one. Going through different exercises, scriptures, discussions, and so forth. That's the first one. We'll be going through that starting next week, all the way to Christmas Eve. And so if you don't get it by Christmas Eve,
You're done.
sorry about that. Yeah,
You keep saying that all along.
yeah, we're really sorry, but Christmas won't be the same this year without, you know. Oh, yes, Tony, yes, I see your hand now. Thanks, Tony.
So Harry, you might be really kind of getting into this, but I guess I was getting the what and the why, but I was sort of trying to understand the how in kind of a real practical sense. So it's, at one point it sort of sounded like, okay, there's this 30-day retreat thing, and you've got to sort of think about that, or maybe, get on a waiting list somewhere. There's a big demand, and only so many directors, and one-on-one meetings with somebody who's maybe trained to be a companion in your spiritual journey. But then I think now what you're sort of saying is we're going to do this together as a group in this class for a while. I guess I was trying to understand, okay, if this is like, yeah, hey, I'm totally on board with this, I'm convinced. The question is, what do I do?
Yeah. Tony, great question. And yes to every one of those. It comes in so many different ways. Spiritual direction. It can be one-on-one, and you have a director every time you meet. And in between times, you will go and do some of the assignments by reading scripture. And if you don't get to all the scriptures, that is fine. But come back and we'll go and talk about a particular passage for 2 or 3 weeks. It goes at your pace, one-on-one. Now, some people will not follow those exercises at all. They will want to be part of spiritual direction, but they also just want to come and talk about what's going on in their life. What's missing? What isn't missing? How can I find something deeper in my day-to-day living? And that spiritual direction with the director there may help guide the person in the conversation enough to understand that these are all important questions. And here are some ways that we might be able to address them. It's up to the person. It's not the director saying, now, wait a second, that's not really what you're supposed to be talking about. No, anything you're talking about is what you're supposed to be talking about. Okay? Because there's some deeper sense underneath it all is that question, where is God? Whatever you use that name, a name for God, something meaningful, something sacred, something more than I see. Where is that in my life? And so, Tony, it could be a group spiritual direction. I've been leading a group spiritual direction since 2013. Same people, breakfast once a month. And it may not look like a spiritual direction, but we are. We're still talking and sharing important matters over a muffin. Yeah. Oh, and some chai tea. Yeah. Always get the chai. So, Tony, yeah, there's so many different ways to do this. I've done, groups, individual. Sometimes people can do it by phone, internet, whatever. It just depends. And that's the beauty of it. There are really no rules in terms of trying to figure this out. But let me just emphasize again: the director is so important. You won't get as much out of it your own because the director can kind of sense what might be going on and may ask certain questions that may open up new avenues you never would have thought of before about what you're experiencing. But it's really a journey with you and God, whatever name you want to use, and the director helps you with that journey. So I hope that helps a little bit, Tony, as you move into this. Thank you. Great question. Appreciate that question. So the first week, then you get through it all. You know you're loved by God. The second is really, in a sense, you fall in love with Jesus. You learn about who he is, what he did, what he taught, what he experienced, what Jesus means to you, and you just learn about the stories of Jesus, and sharing the experiences you have of Jesus in your life. So that's the second part. If you can't get through that in one sitting, then you spend time until you really get a sense of who Jesus is. The third part is maybe the most crucial part. It is the Garden of Gethsemane. It's one story in a sense, but it's many stories. But it's focused in on that story of Jesus after the Last Supper. He goes into the garden and he asks his disciples to stay awake. And what do? They fall asleep. We know that. And then he needs to go on alone. Well, this third movement may be the most difficult movement. It's the question of whether you fall asleep, as you probably have before in your life, especially in your faith journey, perhaps, or do you follow Jesus to the cross? Disciples fell asleep, and we do more than what they did in the garden. If you decide to fall asleep, then you're going to stay there. That's fine. You stay where you need to be. You are where you are. But if you decide to make that step and turn that direction to the cross, you'll be following Jesus into that final few days of his life, and it doesn't look pretty. Jesus gave up his life, and in this way, you have to know you're going to be giving up something. Follow Jesus, you're going to give up something that's probably blocking your way to understanding better God's Spirit in your life. Whatever that might mean for you, individually. If you get through that, where you have to change, you're looking in a different direction now, or something inside you has to change and you work at it. What happens then to Jesus? He dies. 3 days later, what happens? Rises, new life, resurrection, all those things. You can't have new life without a death of something. You can't have a resurrection without, all those things. You just can't jump from getting through movement 1 to movement 4 without going through movements 2 and 3. And that is really, many people don't make it. And when you do, then you say, wow, I made this mountaintop. I know now everything I need to know, right? And pretty soon you come back and say, but does God really love me still? Does that work? I don't know how to, and then you're back at movement 1. Just like the cycle of the Christian year. Like the cycle of the gospel. God comes into the world through a child. We know that God loves us deeply, moving into a life in the flesh. And then we learn about this love embodied in Jesus. And then we know that at some point the powers that be are going to try to squash all of that. The empire, whatever you want to use for an empire in our own day. And then you know that Jesus dies as we might, if we were to follow him. And then at the end, there's always this sense of new life because you went through that. It's all up and down, but that darkness of Gethsemane and the cross and the tomb, beyond that thing comes that new life. Every major figure I know of that's done something important to the world has always gone through the dark night, the garden, in whatever phrase you want to use, dying to something in order to be able to then do what he or she was able to do by that sense of newness, that sense that I know now my role in this world and here's what I can offer. Go through every great person that we can remember in our minds and look at their stories, and they're probably going to have that kind of story. Think of Mandela. I've been 27 years in prison. the dark night, the Garden of Gethsemane. He comes out, and look what he did, was able to forgive, able to move on in that new life. Think about it, Gandhi, his life, and how that moved up and down in the dark night at all that he had to suffer. Chavez, the same thing. Bonhoeffer, thank goodness he gave his life. For this guy. So you go through all the great ones, Dorothy Day, you go through all these women. It's choir, right? It's not because or rushing. I just want to make sure we're losing some people. A little disconcerting when everyone leaves the class. Thank goodness. Thank you for staying on. And so you get the movements, and we'll go through those seasons of the year from Advent all the way through Lent and Easter, and then Pentecost is that sense of your life, that Easter season to Pentecost. Yeah.
There's very good time, but just a personal breakthrough on the word direction. Because I'd always thought it was a misnomer to have spiritual direction, because I was experiencing the word direction to equate with director. So a spiritual director seems wrong relative to one's finding one's own direction. And this is a word, how words can plant a framework in your mind. So it's like how to highlight on my own direction.
If somebody else is telling you where to go.
Yeah.
I totally get that. Totally.
Yes,
I
I
know, I'm
know.
pretty sure you're not gonna tell me where to go.
So maybe, gee, I've struggled with, how can someone be a spiritual director? And can you enlighten me about
It's a question that in every training has always come up. And the question about whether we are called spiritual directors or we are called spiritual companions, because they're one and the same. I think the reason that we stay with the direction is because that person who is your director, the responsibility of that person is to seek Spirit's guidance, and then to help you look to Spirit to guide you. So when I go into spiritual direction with someone, I have to set aside all of my Presbyterian folks, even though that's very much me. And I have to really listen to where that person is in their spiritual life, wherever that is, and help guide them to the next step where they can get to these four spaces. But we, as directors, are not in the business of directing. We're in the business of taking in Spirit's guidance and helping you see how Spirit is guiding you. And whether you're listening. Sometimes you think you might be listening, but it takes just a little probing question. It takes just a little observation from the person who's with you to say, I've heard this word a few times. Do you want to talk about that? And help you really unwind the knots. But we're not unwinding the knots. We're just helping you unwind the knots. And the training is helping to be the kind of listener that can be praying with Spirit at the same time that you're listening to a person speak. But never to give advice. Which is the difference between, I think, counseling, in that the focus for counseling is to help you go from point A to point B. Whereas the focus of a spiritual direction session is to get you from wherever your point is to the next step, which may be circular, and it may not be A, B, C, D. It may be A, Z, A, Y, X, 2. It's just like you are as an individual.
Nicely put. Nicely put. Thanks.
Well, I just am sitting here thinking, I can't imagine doing that for very many people, Jeannie. I mean, that just sounds like such a huge commitment from the director's point of view that it's like, it kind of blows me away. It's like, wow, I wouldn't think you could do a lot of people at one time.
Well, you don't run 9 a day.
I don't think so. I'm thinking maybe like one a year.
Well, there's something that
That's a huge
also
commitment.
has the flexibility that spirit takes it. I have one person who actually wants to meet every other week for 3 months. So she meets the boundaries. And so we're working in these 3 months. I have one who wants to meet every single week because that's the way they are seen. Most meet about once a month. And you as a director have to listen to spirit. And spirit guides you. Is this too many? Do you have enough time? Usually spirits guiding me to, we need to let a few other things stop. Really, that's exactly where I am right now. I'm having to let a whole lot go so that I can focus on the direction and not on, and it's really spirit directing me to be able to make room for others because I've been busy with committees and busy with attendance and busy with other things that I'm not being called to do.
Well, 2 more things before we close. Just to give you a little sense to experience spiritual direction. I use this often. It's called a nation's contemplation. You see, I gave you a picture of a seashore, and it's like this. It's from Luke 11, Luke 5, 1 through 11. It's a story of Jesus beside the lake of Gennesaret, Sea of Galilee. And it's a story where I want everyone just get comfortable. I'm going to read it through. And I want you not to think about all your Bible studies in the past where you say, well, okay, it's the Sea of Galilee, not Gennesaret. Jeez, I wish they get it straight. Or this or that about what it looks like to be, or what scholars have thought through the years about what it means to let down the nets. No, get rid of all of that. It's all part of it still, but be open to the story and experience with all your senses. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel and touch? What do you smell? What do you say? What are the words you might be using right now? Find yourself in the story. This is another way of Bible study. It's in the story and see what it does for you in this particular time in your life. And so I would say, I'm going to read it through once. You close your eyes. So you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in this story. At the end, if you have anything you want to share about what you saw, talked about, heard, whatever, then please share. And we'll be closing soon after that. So here it is. And the same online, just listen to the story. It's a familiar story. And get into the story yourself and see what it might do for you. Once, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw 2 boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. I'm going to bring you back now and just get a sense of hearing that story, not particularly reading it or remembering from other time, but hearing it again and finding yourself hopefully in that space, that place, and what you experience, and not what you think your mind is telling you what the story is about. Anyone have anything to share at all about this story? Anyone see anything? Hear anything?
I think for me, when at first, when just to think you're on the shore and it's just the water that's lapping and it's usually just really quiet and peaceful. And then when you got to the part that the crowds were pressing in, whether or not it was real people or whether or not it was just in the person's head, that you feel something pushing in, then it takes away from that calmness of the shore, and it's just kind of going through that whole thing of just throw your nets back in. It was just a lot of different emotions of being overwhelmed. And then it's like, it's okay, you don't have to be overwhelmed, and then overwhelmed again. And then I really pretty much lost it when they get back to the shore, because being literal that I am, it's like, well, where'd all those people go? And like now they're just gonna like walk off and follow this other person. I lost it. I lost the peacefulness of the water, and I even kind of lost the rush of the people a little bit, trying to put that together.
So focus in on what you did experience, and the peacefulness, and then the people crowding in. What does that like? What might that mean for you? What's the next level of thinking about that? Not thinking, but experiencing or feeling in your life. And you may want to look at this story again and read through and see what happens next, because you got lost in there a little bit. And find out maybe that's, some things that are important too. The loss is often important as well. It's that kind of thing that we would say as we try to experience this. What do you see here? That's it. Yeah, go ahead. It's hard for some. They'll go right to their mind. But other ones find themselves in story. How important that is. Any other responses to that? Well, I'll give you one story. Think about what you experienced. You don't have to share it all. But as I close, I was doing this with a young woman at Notre Dame College, not too far from where I live, not university, but college, Catholic college. And they had a week of all sorts of Catholic things, and one was spiritual direction. And so they had my class go and volunteer to be spiritual directors for all these students. I had one young woman who was stone-faced most of the time. I even brought in Atticus, the wonder dog, my dog, the next time I met the next day, just to loosen things up a little bit, thinking maybe she might enjoy a dog, just to kind of. And she said she didn't like dogs.
Oh, my goodness gracious.
Atticus tried to get on her lap, and she pushed him away. So I thought, sorry, Atticus, I led you astray. Okay. We went through this story the next day. My last chance, because nothing was breaking in. And at the end, I said, "So, did you see anything?" And she looks up at me and she says, "I saw Jesus' eyes."
What?
And so that was my time with him. I went to my supervisor the next week to talk over what happened and all these different experiences. And I told him about this story. And I said, she saw Jesus' eyes. And he brightens up and says, that's all she needs right now, is to see Jesus' eyes. It's all good. It's all good. And so, whatever you get out of this story, maybe you see Jesus' eyes or not, whatever you get may mean something to you that you don't know right now, and it may unfold later on. The job of spiritual direction, or the joy of spiritual direction, is to uncover and discover a new experience. This journey. So, one last thing I'll give you is simply something to take back with you. It's called the examen of consciousness. Anyone ever heard of this before? The examen, they pronounce it examen, not examine. I don't know why, but that's what it's called. It is something that goes back to Ignatius, but there are many variations of it. The first done in Spanish, and now it's in English, but different translations. But it's a way of looking back in your day, or maybe even in the morning, if you want to do it in the morning, but in the evening often, you go through 5 different parts of it. And you see the 5 different parts, and I'll just show it. Maybe it's up to, I don't know if you can read this, but this is what it'll look like. And I can send you a copy of this as well. There are 5 different movements of this. And God, I believe at this moment I'm in your presence and you're loving me. Grateful for your love. That's the first one. God, you know my needs better than I do. Give me your light and hope as I review my day. I need help to see my motives, the values that I live by. Number 3, God, help me now to review the events of this day in order to recognize your blessings and my failure. Help me to notice the opportunities given and the blessings I didn't recognize. 4, God, I ask for your forgiveness for my mistakes, and I thank you for all your personal blessings to me. You are very good to me. And the final one, as I look forward to the remainder of this day or tomorrow, make me aware that you are with me. Show me how to become the person you want me to be. Be with me and help me to be aware of your presence. And so, something you take home with you, use it if you wish. Don't have to, but if it seems to make sense to you to review your day, it's one way to kind of get a sense that God is present in your life. In what ways? Well, you'll find the blessings. You'll find those experiences.
We've handed this out before.
Yeah, I handed out before. In different colors, often during Lent. But if you haven't had it before, you have it now. So thank you.
Picture of the church.
That's it.
Little card.
That's right, a little card that fits your wall.
That in my wallet.
Good. And that one to put your windshield or something. I don't know what it is. But anyway, thank you all. And should you wish to become part of Spirit Direction in some form, talk to me. Make sure something happens. If it's a group, if it's individual, whatever it might mean. But it's something that is so important in life, any life, and so important in the life of the faith community. And try to have this level of experiencing the divine. So thank you all. Next week, tomorrow's women will be here. The group that brings Israeli young women and Palestinian women together for a week or two or so in Santa Fe to get them to know each other. How apropos that is for them to come and talk about what may be happening in their understanding of Gaza and Israel in this time. So next week, tomorrow's women will be here now, guide us in seeing this situation through their eyes. So thank you all. Blessings to all of you. Go in peace.
Thank you.
Thank you all.